Hello guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures. And today we're going to be having a look through the wonderful conservation pack. So the theme of this pack was, instead of the typical biome or like continent, this is based a lot more on kind of the conservation of different species. These are species that have been really helped out by zoos or are common in zoos. And that have been breeding them and doing reintroduction projects and basically keeping these species alive and taking a big instrumental part on saving them by just having them. And that's really, really important thing that I think is really cool that this DLC showcases and gives a lot of animals that people were really looking for. There's two animals on this list that were literally the first and second on the meta wish list, so I completely understand why this theme pack was cool, and I'm really glad that they went with it because it really is a wonderful pack and I'm a big fan, especially with all the building things and things like that. But we're not going to get into that. We're going to talk about the animals. So we're going to be starting off with the exhibit animals today. We're not going to go talk about these guys just yet. We're going to have a look at the wonderful little exhibit guy here. We've got the Axolotl. So let me get into picture mode. Let's see if I can find one. Well, there's a couple there. Let's have a look at you guys and get out of the mode, and then just keep a. There we are. So let's exit out of that. So these are wonderful little axolotls. So the axolotl, or its scientific name is Ambistona mexicanum. These guys are a pedomorphic salamander that are closely related to the tiger salamander. And as you guys kind of probably know, that these are quite common in the pet trade, but sadly these guys are considered critically endangered and probably very likely of going extinct in the wild, very sadly. They originally were found in several lakes around Mexico City, such as Lake Zixchapau, I believe how you pronounce that. I'm obviously not the best. Zanachula, how you pronounce that, I'm not sure. But due to urbanization and water pollution introduced species, these guys are listed as critically endangered. With actually the wild population estimated now is to be decreasing, and is believed to be about 50 to 1,000 individuals left. So that's very, very sad, of course. But we're going to talk a little bit more about these guys once we get a chance. So, a sexually mature adult axolotl, at about age of 18 to 27 months, they reach a length of about 15 to 45 centimeters, or 6 to 18 inches long, although they size generally about 23 centimeters or 9 inches, and common greater than 30 centimeters or 12 inches is rare. So those 45 centimeter individuals are very, very uncommon. And you can see these guys possess features typical of larvae of salamander, with these large external gills and a caudal fin that goes down their back. But what really makes this weird is that the term pedomorphic means they retain childlike traits. So these guys don't really have an adult stage. They basically take their adult stage and keep it in their child stage. So they're basically a baby salamander with adult reproductive organs. And you can actually artificially induce this growing up and metamorphosis into an adult, but often that actually can be detrimental to their health, so it's recommended that you don't do it. And this can potentially be a way of evolving to this new habitat. Since they already adapted to water, why not just keep the traits that you are as a child and then just grow up and just have reproductive organs? But it's really interesting. And you can see their heads are quite wide with these long fins, and males can be identified by their swollen cloacae, and they have these 3 pairs of external gill stalks, also called rami, which come between their heads and allows them to breathe through the water and things like that. They allow for gas exchange. And they actually have barely visible vestigial teeth, which develop during metamorphosis, but these guys obviously don't go through that kind of metamorphosis, so they only have vestigial teeth. And they primarily feed by suction feeding, so they typically just open their mouth and use pumping to gulp stuff as well, and just bring food in their mouth. And they also will also use buccal pumping, that's gulping air from the surface that allows them to get oxygen to their lungs as well. And they have 4 pigmentation genes, and this has been really interesting to look at. And the normal wild type, as you can see, this is the normal wild type that's like brownish to tan with gold speckles, and there's lots of mutants that you can find in especially captivity. It's like xanthic with grey with black eyes, golden albinos, regular albinos, things like that. And they're obviously bred a lot in the pet trade because people are really interested in that. But these guys are only native to the freshwater of Lake Zuchamilo and Lake Calico in the Valley of Mexico, with Lake Chalo does no longer exists because it's been drained as a flood control measure, and the other lake has become kind of a remnant of its form itself, which exists mainly in canals. And the water temperature rarely rises about 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, although that may fall down to 67 degrees or 43 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter, or even perhaps lower. So surveys in 1998, 2003, and 2008 found about 6,000, 1,000 to 100 axolotls per square kilometre in its habitat, and a 4-month-long survey turned up with no surviving individuals in the wild, and just a month later 2 wild ones were spotted in the canals. And the wild population has been put under heavy pressure because of the growth of Mexico City, and they're currently considered like critically endangered because of that. And non-native fish has also been introduced, such as Asian carp and tilapia, which have been introduced and eat the young axolotls and as well as their primary food source, which sucks. And what also makes these guys really cool is that they're really cool for a model organism. So they're large numbers are bred in captivity, although the wild population is almost extinct. They can grow back limbs. They have been used to study like heart defect studies as well. They've been used as a model organism in laboratories for a while. They're able to regenerate limbs and things like that. And they've also had their genome sequenced. And they actually have a 32 billion base pair genome, which is 10 times larger than the human genome. So that's a really interesting fact about these guys as well. And the reason they kind of look like that is because, as I mentioned, they're paedomorphic, or they have neoteny. So they're basically a baby salamander, but with adult like reproductive organs, and they had that to allow them to survive. And if you often inject iodine or something into that, that promotes the thyroid to make the hormones to make them go into their metamorphosis. But that's obviously not good for their health sometimes. But when they're metamorphosized, they typically look like a tiger salamander. Though there's some differences, but most of the times you shouldn't really do it because it is not a good thing for them. And yeah, as I mentioned, they are actually a quite common pet. You can find them in pet stores everywhere, though sadly the wild population has decreased as it is. And these guys like slightly cooler water. They like water between 16 to 18 degrees, about 61 to 64 degrees Fahrenheit. And they do like temperatures higher. They don't like temperatures higher than 24 degrees, and they can lead them to be a little bit more stressed and eventually die. And chlorine you can't really have in there because it really affects them, especially being an amphibian. And in captivity they feed on salmon pellets, bloodworms, earthworms, waxworms, also feeder fish, but we got to be careful with those because it takes parasites. But yeah, they're quite common, as I mentioned, and obviously in captivity. But sadly, that wild population, as decreased as they are, only 1,000 left or so, as a maximum estimate, is very, very sad. And it's sad that most likely that the history of these guys from now on is most likely just going to be in people's tanks in their living rooms or in laboratories, which is very sad. It's very sad to learn that this animal's habitat is completely gone. And a really good example of why this pack was good, because we get this wonderful, cool new species. So before I forget, what we're going to do is have a look at the Zoopedia. Where's the Zoopedia there? There we are. So axolotl, just mainly stuff I mentioned. They only found a few lakes in Mexico, and the lake Zuchamilo is their only habitat, and they get about 300 grams in weight. That would be very big axolotl, and you can see they only live in that little area there now. And group size 1 to 5. They're solitary in the wild, but they can live in captivity together, provided there's enough space and all that. They're promiscuous, and they don't have a dominant system. They get average 30 centimeters long, 8 years. But they can actually live, I believe, like more than that, and they weigh about 300 grams. Sexual maturity is a 1-year-old. They have sex till they die. They have 2 or 3 babies per mating event. They have a 0-month gestation or incubation period, and the interbirth period is 12 months, and they're easy to breed in captivity, which often reflects, obviously, how common they are in the pet trade. And some fun facts, I've already mentioned some of these. They have the largest animal genome ever. They feed on mollusks, small fish, things like that. They're pedomorphic, and this means they retain the characters of a juvenile throughout their entire life, and unlike most amphibians, do not metamorphosize, which I already covered. And the name comes from Axolotl, which is the Aztec god of fire and lightning, and they've been researched because of their ability to grow limbs and things like that. So, yeah, pretty much covered that already. But next, we're moving on into our habitat species. We have got the Scimitar-Horned Oryx, which is a really, really cool animal. So these guys, also known as the Sahara Oryx or the Scimitar-Horned Oryx, or just the Scimitar Oryx, these guys were once widespread around Africa, or North Africa, but sadly they were declared extinct in the wild in 2000. But yeah, they've got a very interesting conservation story that we're going to delve into. So, because of a lot of hunting and things like that, there was obviously massive decreases, and basically they only lived in people's ranches and farms and things like that. But as we'll get to, it's a happy ending to the story. But we'll talk about more of their bodily features. So the Scimitar-Horned Oryx, as you can see, they're a straight-horned antelope. They're obviously an oryx, so they're related to Gemsbok, things like that. They stand over just 1 meter tall, or 3 feet 3 inches at the shoulder, and the males weigh between 140 to 210 kilograms, with the females being about 91 to 140 kilograms. So that's between basically 201 and 460 pounds. And their adult body length is kind of about 240 to 240 centimeters, or 55 to 94 inches, from the head to the base of the tail, with the tail itself being about 45 to 60 centimeters, or 18 to 24 inches, and it ends with a tuft like that. And they are sexually dimorphic. That means the males are typically a bit larger than the females. And you can see they've got this quite distinctive coat. They've got this like a white coat with these orange-ish markings around there and some lines across their face. And they also have these black portions at the tip of the tongue and things like that helps prevent sunburn. So the white coat actually helps them repel heat in their very warm habitat. And you can see the calves are born with these yellow coats, and they lack distinguishing markings, but they appear later in their life, at about 3 to 12 months. And both male and females have horns, but the females typically tend to be a lot more slender, and the males are generally much more impressive, as you could kind of assume. I think this is the other female. This is the male. Really, really wonderful animal here. So their horns, you can see, are long and symmetrical, and they curve backwards, which is very characteristic of the species. They can get to about 1 meter or 1.2 meters long, or 3 to 3 foot 11 in both sexes. But they are hollow and can easily break. And the female, she has udders with 4 teats, and they have these large hooves that you can see here that allow them to walk across the sand in their dry habitats. They actually typically live for about 20 years, and since the Smithsonian National Zoo, there was a female that lived to about 21, and an exceptional female has been generally have a lifespan of about 15 years. So really, really interesting animal, cool animals as well. So in terms of their ecology, these guys are very social and live in large herds of about 2 to 40 individuals with a dominant bull, and they often will gather in groups of several thousand across migrations, when they obviously used to be much more common. And during the wet season, they migrated north into the Sahara, and they are diurnal, so that means they come out in the cool early mornings and evenings, and in the day they rest under like trees and shrubs, or just try and dig decretions in the sand with the hooves and try and rest there. And males will fight often, but not too violently, of course, and they are prey for animals such as lions, leopards, hyenas, vultures, hunting dogs, and things like that. So they typically have a lot of adaptations to survive in the obviously hot Sahara. They have a lot of adaptations that allow them to conserve water as well, so they have large kidneys for that, and they can tolerate higher temperatures that would be lethal to most mammals. So that's also very interesting. They have a diet that's very, very generalist. They feed on lots of succulent plants, shrubs, things like that, and they can actually survive without water from 9 to 10 months because their kidney actually prevents water loss through urination, which is an adaptation to their desert habitat. They'll feed a lot on water-rich plants like wild melons and things like that as well. And we'll have a look at talk about the babies as we talk about the reproduction. Let's see if we can find a baby. There they are. Look at these little cuties. So both male and females reach sexual maturity at about 18 to 24 months of age, with births peaking between March and October, and mating frequently is greater when environmental conditions are favorable, and in zoos they're generally more active in autumn. The estrus for these guys lasts about 24 days, and gestation lasts about the birth periods is less than 332 days, so a little over a little under a year. And these guys, obviously, when they court, the males will stand parallel to each other and fight each other, and until the female allows the female to mount her. The female allows the male to mount her, actually. And pregnant females will often leave the herd for the week and give birth to their calf. And gestation lasts about 9 months, where the single calf is born. They typically are born at about 10 to 15 kilograms, or 22 to 33 pounds, with twin births being somewhat rare. Only about 0.7% of births have been observed to be twins. But then both the mother and the calf kind of return to the herd within hours of birth. And weaning for these guys will start about 3.5 months, and the young become fully independent from their mother about 14 weeks old. So, in terms of the habitat, as I mentioned, they typically lived in grassy deserts, semi-deserts, and steppes that lived across central North Africa, and they've been reintroduced in Libya and things like that, where they typically like to live in these areas. In 1936, there was actually a single herd of 10,000 oryx seen in the steppe area of Chad, and by the 1970s, Chad was home to more than 95% of the world population. But as we see, it kind of all went downhill from there. So let's have a look at the dad while we talk about that. Here's Dad. Big bad Dad. So the conservation really starts, the story starts around the 7,000 years ago, when the Sahara basically became dry and they began to decline a little bit because of their suitable habitat was gone. And then humans started hunting them for both their meat and horns, which actually decreased their population. The northern population was already almost lost by the 20th century, and with the introduction of horses and firearms, that basically nomadic hunters were able to hunt these guys basically whenever they wanted. And the decline of these southern populations accelerated this as the Europeans basically began to settle and hunt the areas and hunt them for trophies and things like that. And the French involvement in the Second World War and the Civil War in Chad that had started around the 1960s had caused heavy decreases in the species as they were hunted for food. And also roadkill, settlements near watering holes as well, and cattle, they got competed off. And they've been considered regionally extinct in places such as Egypt, Libya, Burkina Faso, Western Sahara, Sudan, basically since 2000, but there have been reports of Chad's sightings in Chad, but they've considered unsubstantiated, so really don't know. And until like 1985, there was about 500 or so oryx estimated to be surviving in Chad, but in 1988 there was only a few surviving in the wild. But a global breeding program now exists, as they caught the last few individuals and put them in like Texas ranches and breeding programs all across the world, pretty much. So, as 2015, there's about 1,750 maintained as a breeding program, and at the peak, there was about 11,000 kept on Texas farms, and 4,000 were held in the Arab state on the Persian Gulf. With reintroduction plans basically going across now, since like the late 90s up to now, there've been huge fenced-in habitats for these guys to basically try and release them back into the wild. And Chad has been really leading these reintroduction efforts around basically the Orirem Orari Game Reserve. I've totally butchered that, but it's around Abu Dhabi. That's basically the size of Scotland, and is actually one of the world's largest protected areas. So this basically large reserves, they've let them go free and kind of trying to help them re-establish themselves in the wild. And the first group was released at about 2016, with the group being about 21 animals, and they have produced a calf, which had been the first wild-born calf in more than 20 years. And a second group was also joined with 6 males and 8 females in 2017. So there have been some really big efforts to reintroduce them into the wild. So there are species really on the rebound, and they're a great conservation ambassador and example as well. So really, really cool. So we'll have a look at their Zoopedia. So they're extinct in the wild. As you can see, there's 1,800 total, and they live in semi-wild and national parks, reintroduced as well, and reserves. So these guys, or Oryx dama is their name, they lived across northern Africa, a lot of that. I've already mentioned a lot of this, but really, really interesting species. You can see that's basically their only wild habitat now, but they used to live all across northern Africa, so like Egypt, Senegal, Morocco, so basically all around here. Really beautiful. So the group sizes, they're like 10 to 11, 3 to 11, I mean, so up to 1 male and 10 females. And batch of the groups can be up to 40 individuals. And they're polygamous and shy, and guests can't enter their habitat. So their size, as you can see here, is about 1.5 meters tall at the shoulder, so that's about average. Life expectancy 18 to 7.5 years for different sexes, and the males are a little bit bigger, 175 kilograms, while the females are 115. So they reach sexual maturity at about 2 years old, and they are able to breed until they die. They have one baby per mating event. Gestation period is about 8 months. The interbirth period is about 10 months, and they are average to reproduce in captivity. So, yeah, this is a really cool example of how zoos and breeding programs really do help conservation. And I think having this species in as like one of the most famous examples, and we'll get to another really good example, is really shows the work that zoos do in terms of conservation and how vital they are. So we're almost like halfway. So we have got here the Amur leopard. So this is a subspecies of the typical leopard. So these guys are native to southeastern Russia and northern China, and they're considered critically endangered. As of 2007, there was only 19 to 26 individuals living in the southeastern Russia and northeastern China, and considered one of the rarest cats in the world. So as of 2015, there's believed to be fewer than 60 individuals and that survive in Russia and China, and there's about... in 2021, the most recent estimate is about 210, so they're definitely doing a little bit better than they were before. But results of genetic research also considers that they are genetically close to the leopards of northern China and Korea, suggesting that this population had become fragmented during the late, early 20th century. And yeah, really, really cool animals here. So they're not too different from other leopards. The main reason you can tell them apart is because they have this long, pale cream-colored coat, which is particularly in winter, and they have these large rosettes, as you can see, along their flanks. Typically, just a lot fluffier because they obviously live in colder climates. And they're actually typically a little bit smaller than, or kind of on the average, you could say. Males will measure about 107 to 136 centimeters, or 42 to 54 inches, with about a 82 to 90 centimeter tail, or 32 to 35 long tail, with a shoulder height of about 64 to 78 centimeters, or 25 to 31 inches, and they weigh about 32 to 48 kilograms, or 71 to 106 pounds, with the females weighing about 25 to 42.5, or 55 to 94 pounds. So, as I mentioned, these guys now they're restricted to the Russian Far East, and they live only about an area of 7,000 square kilometers, and they're well adapted to that cool climate, where they hunt food such as sika deer, boars, things like that, and there's been camera trap footage catching these guys in different areas, and they tend to do quite well. Their habitat is fragmented. The historical range, though, it seems that the range may have extended into Japan, and historically they would have lived across the Korean peninsula, lots of parts around Beijing, and northern parts of China, and like far eastern parts of Europe. But due to human hunting, and they were extirpated under Japanese rule and kind of just reduced back into there. During this time, there was like 642 leopards were killed during the Japanese occupation of Korean peninsula around 1910 to 1945, with the last known leopard being killed in South Korea in 1960. So that shows how tied that is politically to how the decline of these species. A lot of it's politics, and it's a lot more than you realize. But yeah, these guys are typically solitary. They're not too different in behavior in terms of other subspecies or other leopard populations. These guys are crepuscular. They come out day during dawn, or they could be nocturnal or diurnal. It really just depends. It depends what they're preying on, as they feed on roe deer, sika deer, and boar. And they're extremely conservative with the choice of territory, and they usually can be found around a river basin, places like that. And their typical size home range can be between 5,000 and 30,000 hectares, with individuals using these same hunting trails to move around and kind of rest places. They use them over and over in many years. And in the Usari region, they will follow herds of ungulates, and they mainly prey on, as I mentioned, roe deer. They'll eat waipadi as well, musk deer, elk, wild boar, hare, mice. Even they'll be known to prey on young black bears or Asian black bears, so that's also very interesting. But yeah, we'll have a look at these wonderful, cute little babies here. So in terms of their reproduction, they reach sexual maturity about 2 to 3 years old, and they are able to reproduce up to about 10 to 15 years of age, with gestation being about 90 to 105 days, and they're usually born about 500 to 700 grams, as you can see here. And the young will open their mouths about these, not open their mouths, open their eyes at about 7th to 10th day before they start crawling about the 12th to 15th day, where they go. And by the second month, that's when they emerge out of their den and kind of join their mother and do things. Lactation will continue about 5 or 6 months until they're weaned at about 3 months old. And cubs will reach independence at about 2 years of age, and they'll stay with their mother until they're about 2 years old or 18 months old, with juveniles staying with their mother often in times of estrus. So, yeah, sometimes they'll stay around with her. Obviously, it's a bit of a harsh environment. She'll want to take care of them. But yeah, really, really cute guys. But yeah, as I mentioned, the main threat to these guys is similar to other leopards, but since these guys are so endangered, it's a very poignant example, especially where they live. Big examples of things that hurt them is deforestation. Lots of areas where they live have been cut down. Not overpopulation. Habitat loss has been kind of goes with that. Lots of it's been converted to obviously farmland, and people live there. They don't want leopards and tigers and bears around their places. But another thing that's really been bad for these guys is that since they're so isolated from other populations, they've become inbred and they have low genetic diversity. And also there's been one that's been caught with canine distemper, which is another big thing. And also issues of poaching. People want to kill leopards for their skins, which is very sad, but obviously people like that. There's also development projects to develop oil pipelines, and logging has really hurt them as well. But luckily, there's been lots of conservation in place. There's been areas put aside for them, national parks. Same with like the Siberian tiger, which is also very endangered. There have been like patrols, set up nature areas, especially large ones since they need these large habitats. Also, there's a very extensive captive breeding program, which was founded in 1961 by 9 wild-born founders. And as of 2011, there's about 173 captive Amur leopards held worldwide. And this is obviously very good to add genetic diversity to the wild population. And there have been reintroduction efforts from different animals and things like that. But even just getting their genetics out into the wild is a very good idea. But yeah, really, really cool species. I'm a big fan of these guys. Really, really cute. Look at this guy playing around. So we're going to have a look at their zoopedia. So the wild population, as you can see here, as recent as 2021 is 110, which is a big improvement, but obviously there's a long way to go until they're out of the woods. We can see their restricted habitat there. See, they used to live across all this area here around the Korean Peninsula and into the Pleistocene. They would have lived in Japan, but now they're only restricted there because of hunting. They live solitary or alone, so you can have up to one male and one female. And their dominance hierarchy, they don't have one because they don't live with each other. They're promiscuous, and then relationship is neutral to humans, but obviously you can't have a guest in their habitat unless they want your finger bitten off. Their size typically is about 71 centimeters tall at the shoulder to 67 centimeters tall at the shoulder. Life expectancy is about 15 years, typical of a leopard. And their weights, as you can see, the male's about 40 kilograms, female's about 33. So typically male leopards are slightly bigger than females. And age of sexual maturity, as we kind of covered, about 3 years. Age of sexual sterility is about 15 years. They have 1 to 3 babies per mating event. They have a gestation period of about 3 months, so about 100 days. The interbirth period is about 33 months, and they are average reproduction in captivity. So the Amur leopard, as you can see, they're strong and skilled hunter. They often kill large prey by obviously doing that. They're one of the rarest cats in the world, with only 110 estimated to live as of 2021, in the wild at least. They have a much longer coat, and yeah, there's kind of things that I've already mentioned, but yeah, really awesome. And obviously they don't like anyone. I believe the Scimitar-Horned Oryx, they do like other ones, so let's have a look. So they like living with buffalo, African buffalo, common ostrich, plain zebra, and reticulated giraffe. But yeah, really, really awesome. So, that's our first 3 animals done. Next, we're going to be moving on to the Siamang. So this one's really, really cool. This is a highlight because these guys actually climb around and do things. So let's have a look at this wonderful guy here. So I love Siamang so much. They're at my local zoo as well. They have a breeding pair, and they are so cool. I love them. So the Siamang, as these guys are an arboreal black-furred gibbon. I know Frontier was saying we're never going to get brachiation in gibbons, but they've given it to us anyway. These guys are a black-furred gibbon native to Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. And they are the largest of the gibbons. They can get about twice the size as most other gibbon species. They reach about 1 meter tall and weigh up to 14 kilograms. And as I mentioned, these guys have this long, shaggy coat, and they also have these long arms that allow them to climb. And the average length for a Siamang is 90 centimeters, but they can get up to 150 centimeters in length. And they have this... the face of this large gibbon is they have like a mustache, but it's mainly pretty bald. And these guys live in forest remnants of the Malay Peninsula and Sumatran Islands, where they live in lowland and forests, lowland and mountain forests, especially rainforests. And they typically like to live in groups of individuals of 4 to 6, and they're quite loud, I gotta say. Let's have a look at this one if he climbs, or she climbs. Hopefully she does. But these guys typically live in groups of up to 6 individuals, with about 4 individuals on average. And they will have an average home range of about 23 hectares. And they typically, their day range is typically smaller than other species of gibbons. And these guys have these loud singing, as you can hear there. And they use their gula pouch, I believe they pronounce that. And they obviously expand that to create these loud calls that kind of boom around everywhere. But these guys are just so cool, aren't they? Let's see if we can watch them climb around. So, in terms of their diet, they feed on various plants. They're considered more frugivorous. The Sumatran Siamang is considered more frugivorous, so much more likely to eat fruit than its Malaysian relative. And their see, they're very noisy. Their fruit makes up about 60% of their diet, and they feed on all sorts of different plants, just vines, figs, flowers, and even insects they'll also eat. Lots of those kind of things. Let's see if we can get this one to swing. There he is. So look at that. Brachiation. Really awesome. So, I just love seeing them swing like that. Brachiation is the term for that kind of swinging. You know how gibbons will kind of swing arm to arm. So brachiation, obviously brachy means arm. So they'll often swing into with their arms like that. And look how just lanky they are. So cool. So they feed, being the largest gibbon, they tend to eat more fruits and leaves and things like that. Since they're the biggest gibbon, there's generally a trend that larger apes will feed more on plants and like fruit, leaves. So these guys typically eat a lot more leaves. So let's see if we can get one over here. Look at you. You're climbing down. Of course you would do that while I'm trying to explain how cool you are. But anyway, these guys typically, as I mentioned, they live in a group of about 6 individuals, so average 4. And they often have an adult dominant male, an adult dominant female, and the offspring, infants, and sometimes the subadults. And the subadults usually leave the group after attaining an age of about 6 to 8 years. And the subadults tend to leave earlier. The females tend to leave earlier than the males. And this gestation period, we'll have a look at the cute little baby while we... there he is. Cute little baby. We'll typically talk about their gestation period since he's got the little guys here. Gestation period is about 6 to 7 months, and after the infant is born, the mother will take care of the infant for about its first year of life. And Siamang males tend to offer more parental care to the babies than a lot of other species of gibbons, and they take a major role in carrying the infant around on their body and until it's about 8 months old, and the infant begins to travel independently from its parents around its 3rd year of life. And Siamangs are actually quite monogamous. They're typically known to form mating pairs. And this has been documented spending a lot of time close proximity to each other in comparison to other gibbon species. Though both polyandrous and monogamous groups have been found in Sumatra. And it seems that infants belonging to monogamous groups are actually more likely to receive more overall male care than polyandrous groups. So if you've got a good dad, basically, you're more likely to... If your parents are together, so it's a male-female pairing. And then monogamous, you tend to have a lot more parental care, which is very interesting. And the habitat disturbance also really affects that. So that varies because age and sex groups interacts between intact forests and burnt forests. The burnt and more regrown forests will tend to contain more adult and subadult individuals than forest populations, which have more infants, small juveniles, and live juveniles, which is also very interesting. And also in terms of behavior, as you can tell, they're very, very loud. Let's see if you can get one climbing around here. Look at these awesome guys. I'm a big fan. So they tend to spend most of their time resting, and they will spend more of their time walking around the dawn to dusk, and they will feed by following, moving, and do social activities. And they tend to rest the most during midday, where they take time off to groom and hang out with each other and things like that. So grooming is very important for their social interactions, like a lot of other primates. And the adult males are most involved in grooming as well. And in the dry season, their range is greatly expanded. So they go out to look more food in the dry season. And they're very social species primate, and they have lots of tactile and visual gestures that they use to communicate with each other. And they're also quite territorial. So they produce these loud calls, as you can hear as they try to talk over me. They produce these loud calls to announce their kind of territory and show those boundaries and things like that. And these calls actually may be sometimes asynchronous, and they might be directed at a neighboring group, or they sometimes will kind of take place around a boundary and chase others off their boundary as well. And this role of calling, as you can hear, is typically around the early morning, and they call less after midday, but the peaks of these calls are about 9 to 10 a.m. These calls are kind of it's directed as neighbors rather than those inside its home range. So it's kind of saying, hey, this is my range, go away, make sure you don't come near. And they prefer to actually climb into tall trees and make these calls, so that allows them to better announce them and kind of say, hey, this is my area. And mated pairs also create these loud calls and create these duettings that advertise their status as a mated pair. So the newly formed pairs will actually spend more time singing than an established pair. So having that strong bond allows them to better defend their territories. And the duetting also differs from other species because they're quite complex. And there are these 4 different vocalizations that include booms, barks, screams, and binaural screams. And they typically produce these long barks in females, and then the males generally produce these binaural screams, with both sexes producing all 4 classes of these vocalizations. So another thing they also do, they spread a lot of seeds. Like a lot of the other forest species, since they eat a lot of fruit, they will often spread the seeds and help regenerate the forest. But in terms of their conservation, I know I've been talking a lot about how wonderful they are, but we've got to talk about their conservation and why they deserve to be on this list. They are considered endangered by the IUCN because habitats tend to be very fragmented because of plantations, illegal logging, encroachment, forest fires, and human development. Especially palm oil plantations destroys a lot of their habitat. Also, they've been poached for the pet trade, and they will often capture infant Siamangs and kill their mothers, so they can obviously sell them into the pet trade. But luckily, they live in a lot of protected areas, and I believe the population's in the few thousand, but still an endangered species, and they're quite common in captivity at least. Really, really wonderful animals. Just look at this cute little guy here. But yeah, we're going to talk about their zoopedia. So they are endangered, as I mentioned. We kind of talked about all the things that we kind of talked about here. Endangered species, their populations as agricultural lands kind of increased, all of that. So they are the largest gibbon as well. As you can see, that's their range at the moment. Potentially would have been a lot bigger. So they live in groups with a monogamous breeding pair and their offspring, which usually consists of 2 to 3 juveniles. So it can be up to 5, or even 6. So 5 males, 5 females, with the dominant mating pair leading the family. They are monogamous, they are confident, and guest kind into the habitat. So their average size is about 88 centimeters tall, but they can get up to like a meter tall. So they're twice as big as mainly most other gibbons. Their life expectancy is about 40 years, and they get about 11.5 kilograms. And I believe their largest is about 14 kilograms. So the age of sexual maturity is about 8 years, and they live for about 40 years, and that's when they're sexually sterile. So they can live quite long. Most apes tend to live quite long. They have 1 baby per mating event. They have a gestation period of about 8 months. The interbirth period is about 36 months, but they're easy to reproduce in captivity. So some interesting facts about these guys. They'll often sing, kind of mentioned that. A lot of these we've kind of already mentioned. 2 toes of the Siamang's feet are actually connected by a membrane, which is unique against to the Siamang compared to other given families, within the given family, I mean. And they develop very close bonds with parents mating for life, and the whole group travels together. And they are the largest species given. So yeah. And they also like to share a habitat with a Bornean orangutan, which is always very awesome. And I just want to see them break here one more time before we move on to the last animal. So let's have a look at these wonderful guys here. How are these guys not... I just love them so much. Really nice to see them actually brachiate. Look at that brachiation. And then I have to climb. I remember Frontier saying, no, we're never going to get brachiation, but they've given it to us anyway. But yeah, sorry if that was a bit loud. These guys are clearly very loud. But last but certainly not least, we have got one of the really cool animals of this pack. We have got the Przewalski's horse. So we'll have a look at these guys and we talk about them. So look how beautiful they are. Big animals. I believe this is the male. Yep, this is the alpha male. So Przewalski's horse, or Equus ferus przewalski, also known as the Mongolian wild horse. These guys are a very rare endangered species of subspecies of horse, and they are native to the central steppes of Asia, of Central Asia. And they were named after the Russian geographer and explorer Nikolai Przewalski. And they're similar to the Scimitar-Horned Oryx. They were considered extinct in the wild, but they have been introduced into their native habitats since the 1990s, and there are wild populations around Europe and places like that. So these guys are quite different from your typical domestic horse. They are believed to be the only true wild horse, and they are obviously considered different subspecies. Their ancestral line is they split from a common ancestor from your domestic horse about 38,000 to 160,000 years ago. Before the domestication of the horse, of course. And they were long considered to be the only true remaining horse as compared to the Mustang or the Brumby. Those are feral horses, as they have domestic ancestors. But these guys are the only true wild horse left, though there has been some controversy about that since they're believed to be remains of, obviously, Bontai people using them. But it's obviously very controversial, and most agree that these guys were never domesticated. These are a population that may have been used by people in court, but they were never truly domesticated. These guys are as wild as they come, typically. And some people even considering them a different species, or just call them Equus Przewalski. But in terms of their body, they're considerably quite a bit stockier than modern domestic horses. They have shorter legs, and they typically get about 12 to 14 hands tall, or about 122 to 142 centimeters tall, and they reach lengths of about 2.1 meters, or about 6 foot 11 inches, and they weigh about 300 kilograms, or 660 pounds. And you can see they typically get this dullish color. They can get a lot more orange as well. Just depends on, obviously, the population and things like that, with white around their muzzle and their belly there. And they typically have these quite primitive markings. And unlike a lot of domestic horses that their manes flow down, these guys have tall manes, similar to more like that of a zebra. And they also have hooves that are longer in the front and thicker soles than your feral horse, which allows them to better run over terrain and things like that. So in terms of their genetics, they have a very interesting origin, as I mentioned. They split from these horses, the ancestors of domestic horse, about 45,000 years ago. But there have been lots of evidence in looking to that, potentially around like 160,000 years ago. And there have been some debate whether these guys are truly domestic or truly wild, or were they domesticated sometime in the past and they've just reverted back. But it seems like since there were some actually caught and used by the Bontai people, even if that was the case, they didn't clearly have them long enough to really show that these guys were domesticated. They may have just been kind of a tamed population. Because domestication is very different from being tamed. Domestication is when it's like you turn an aurochs into a cow, or a wild horse like this into a domestic horse. Taming is just having a few individuals of a species, like when people have bears as a pet, or bearded dragons or something like that. They're not a domestic species. They just get used to people, which is a very apt comparison. But in terms of their ecology and behavior, these guys typically live in troops or small herds of about 5 to 15 members, which consists of a male or a stallion and his mares and foals. And modern reintroduced populations kind of have something similar to that, but obviously being much more rarer, they're not as common. The daily life of these horses is similar to that of feral horses. I like the playing with that. So stallions will often herd and drive and defend all the members of the family from predators, and they go around and obviously feed and things like that. Their home ranges are typically about 24 kilometers or 1.2 kilometers in the Hunsati National Park, and it can be quite large in the Great Gobi strictly protected area. And the range of these harems is often separated, but there's a lot of overlap as well sometimes. So let's have a look at... Oh, that's not what we want to look at. We want to have a look at another horse. Look at these wonderful horses. That's the male. Let's have a look at the female here. Really, really pretty. So they maintain visual contact with their families pretty much at all times. And they have many different vocalizations, as you can hear, that they use to communicate with each other. And they also have kicks and make smells and things like that. And the historic population is said to have lived in the wildest parts of the deserts. And they had enjoyed saline districts. And they've actually been observed mostly during spring and the summer at natural wells, and they migrate down to them from higher mountains. And in terms of their diet, these guys feed mostly on vegetation. They feed a lot on grasses and pretty much any types of plants that they find in their habitat. It'll even dig for plants sometimes under snow. And their winter diet is actually quite similar to the winter diet of like feral horses, so that's also very interesting. And as we talk about reproduction, we got to show off this cute little foal. Isn't he adorable? Mating typically in the wild takes place about late spring to early summer, and the mating stallions do not look for a mating partner until the age of 5, and these stallions will assemble groups of mares and challenge the leader for another group of dominance, things like that. And the females are able to give birth at about an age of 3 years old, and they have a gestation period of about 11 to 12 months. And foals are actually able to stand about an hour after birth, and the rate of infant mortality among these guys is about 25%, with 83% of these deaths is infanticide by the leading stallion. And the foals will begin grazing at about a few weeks of age, but they're not weaned from about between 8 to 13 months after birth, and they reach their sexual maturity at about 2 years old. So they're breeding quite fast. And yeah, it's typically all about biology, but why are they so endangered? And we'll get to that. The story starts back into the Pleistocene. So it's believed that there was Przewalski's horses, the wild type. They lived all across Europe and Asia about 20,000 years ago, though they may have been partially Taipan as well. But there had been reports to them prior to their formal characterization of people just looking at, oh, that's a weird horse. But officially named about 1839 or 1888. And after 1903, there were no reports of a wild population until 1947. And local herdsmen reported seeing as many as 50 to 100 of these horses graveling in small groups at a time, but they were only sightings and often only saw 2 or 3 near a well. And the wild population was already rare pretty much by the 19th to 20th century. And they're often seen at a distance, and the range was limited to only a few areas, like as the Danjuran Basin in the Gobi Desert and another area as well. And they seemed to like these areas, and there were 2 distinct populations, but as more people were hunting them in the steppe and all of that competition with livestock hunting, catching for foals for zoological collections, military activities and harsh winters had mainly caused the populations to decline, and they were basically went extinct in the wild not too long after that. So although there had been lots of attempts, there's lots of attempts to catch foals and things like that, but there were lots of attempts to start captive breeding programs about the mid-1930s, and they found that there actually were there were created hybrids as well, and they actually managed to improve this, and after about World War II, these guys were shot as well, and the group in the United States has died out. But only 2 captive populations remained, and there was about 31 remaining horses at the end of World War II, and only 9 becoming the ancestors of the subsequent captive population. And by the end of the 1950s, there was only 12 horses reported in the zoos of the world. And in 1957, there was a wild-caught mare that was captured as a foal and was introduced to the captive population in Ukraine. and this was the last caught wild horse of the 1950s, and they're presumed to went extinct in the late 1960s, with the captive population being the only living representative of these guys. So basically, extinct in the wild, 1960s, and only living individuals were in zoos and breeding programs. But luckily, since then, around the 70s to now, there have been lots of really good conservation efforts trying to bring in genetic diversity, trying to exchange animals between different populations to reduce inbreeding, and dozen zoos hold them, and they've even reintroduced to some places such as the Chernobyl exclusion zone in Belarus and Ukraine, which is after the accident in Chernobyl. They have a population now of 100 Przewalski's horses, so that seems to be a really awesome place that these guys have managed to recover. So that's really, really cool. And there's also been other reintroduction efforts. They've been reintroduced to places such as Western European countries, like from zoos such as the Prague Zoo, returning these wild horses to areas. Even places in Mongolia, they've been returned. Even in France, they were bred in France and then released into Mongolia. So that's really, really awesome. And there's now several populations that have been released into the wild, with lots of efforts from zoos, such as the Zoological Society of London, and lots of efforts from governments and captive breeding programs that have really helped reintroduce them. And this has caused their conservation status to change. So they were called extinct in the wild and then to endangered in 2005. But the latest assessment suggests that they're now endangered. So this really shows how the wild populations, and look how cute that is. The wild population has basically come back from nothing, and now there's believed to be about, let's see what the number is. I'll check the Zoopedia quickly to check the number. So the wild population is about 2,000, so they're just considered endangered, and they're well protected. And another cool little fact, there was actually the first clone Przewalski's horse was born in 2020, and this is part of research to try and bring back extinct species, and using this has also really helped endangered species like the black-footed ferret. But this is really awesome. So what happened was the embryo was cloned through somatic cell nuclear transfer that was put into the egg of obviously a domestic horse, and they put it in a domestic horse and then gave birth to this little Przewalski's horse, which is very cute. And his name is Kurt, and he actually was named after geneticists who developed the idea of cryopreserving genetic material from species that are considered endangered. So he's got a cute name. And he now lives in the San Diego Zoo Safari Park, and he is believed to be really important because once he's old enough and starts to breed, he's going to really help with a lot of the populations in captivity because he's got new genetics. So that's very, very interesting. So he's basically, his mother was a domestic horse, but he's the Przewalski, and that just shows how these big conservation programs and all this effort to bring back the species and how instrumental zoos have been into that. So really, really awesome. But before we end off, we're going to have a quick look at the Zoopedia. So, as I mentioned, the wild population is about 1,900 or 2,000, you could say. They live in national parks, reserves, and have been introduced. So there are wild horse in Mongolia, and they basically went extinct in the wild in the 1960s. You can see that's their modern range now, but they often, there's other populations in Ukraine, Belarus, China, and Russia, kind of taking that niche as the extinct European wild horse, or the tarpan, but that's another kettle of fish that we're not going to get into. In terms of their group size, they typically live in groups of 3 to 8 individuals, up to 1 male and 7 females. Bachelor groups can be 3 to 8, and they have 1 male dominant, and then the females are ranked by age. They're polygamous, they're confident, and guests can't enter their habitat. Remember, these are wild horses, and they're quite big. They're not good for riding as well. You can ride them, but they're not that good at it. Their size is 1.35 meters tall at the shoulder for both sexes. Life expectancy is about 25 years, and they weigh about 305 kilograms. So age of sexual maturity is about 2 years old. Age of sexual sterility is until they die. They have 1 foal per mating event. Their gestation period is about 12 months, and the interbirth period is about 12 months, and they average at reproducing in captivity. And some facts here. The exact taxonomic status of these guys is obviously debated. They're often sometimes considered a separate species of wild horse. It just depends who you ask. And these guys also have 33 base pairs of chromosomes, while modern horses have 32, indicating they've been separate genetically for a long time. And that was an issue with Kurt, and this is the we mentioned here. In 2020, the first cloned Przewalski's horse was born as a part of an assisted breeding program. The foal was created using a frozen cell from a stallion that died in 1998. So that's why he's such an important specimen. He comes from a horse that was died about nearly 20 years ago. So he's very important genetically. There's over 100 horses living in the Chernobyl exclusion zone in Central Europe. And they're thought to have been similar in appearance to what would have been the ancestors of the wild ancestors of the domestic horse, with a dull coat and primitive markings, as you kind of see here. So this is the closest that we'll get to a wild horse, or the ancestors of your modern horse. Such beautiful animals. And last but not least, we'll talk about what they get on with. So they're like the badger and camel. So I got to say, I love this pack, and I really loved being able to talk about all the conservation and stuff that's gone into these guys. So, yeah, really, really awesome pack, and I really hope that we get some more inspired picks and different packs, like the conservation, all these different cool packs. I just hope it kind of never ends. There's so many things I can just keep adding and adding and adding, and free updates and DLC. Really, really awesome to talk about these guys with, obviously, everyone watching. And hope more people learn about these wonderful species and the important role that zoos can and have played in conservation projects and saving species all across the world. So with that inspirational note, I think this would be a great time to end the video. So I really, really, really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to hit the little bell icon to get notified of uploading anything. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. And bye-bye.